ahead and show you the security realm. So any security configuration as far as the domain is concerned is performed under security realms. So under domain structure, go ahead and click on security realms. And notice that there is a realm called My Realm, and this is the default realm. You can have multiple realms if you'd like, but typically only one is needed. So go ahead and click on My Realm. And only one realm can be active at any one time. You can't have multiple active security realms. So in the settings for My Realm, which is the default security realm, we can see that we have users and groups, roles and policies, credential mappings, providers, the database security store, and user lockout and performance. So these are the various things that we can configure within a security realm. So go ahead and click on providers, and under providers, you'll see a tab for each of the type of providers that WebLogic supports. So we have authentication, password validation, authorization, adjudication, role mapping, auditing, yada, yada, yada. And just a word of note, the key stores provider has been deprecated. This was used to actually manage key stores. That has been deprecated and I don't believe is fully supported in 12c. So don't use it. So authentication providers. This is what establishes trust by validating a user. We have a default authenticator and a default identity asserter. And you can have more than one. So you can actually use the default authenticator in combination with, let's say, a database or an LDAP authenticator. So what this allows you to do is that typically in an enterprise application, my administrative users may be embedded within WebLogic's embedded LDAP. However, application or system users that access resources or applications in WebLogic are in LDAP or a SQL database. So you can keep those stores separate if you'd like. And the other benefit to having the default authenticator is that if you were to only have an LDAP or some sort of external authentication provider, and if that provider was down, meaning it was offline when you started the admin server, you would not be able to log in to the admin server or to perform certain functions. So at a minimum, you do want a default authenticator to use the embedded LDAP. So that way you always have a way to get into your environment. You may not be able to log into your application that's using the database or LDAP store that's down, but at least you'd be able to access the admin server in some way. So what I want to do is I want to create a database authentication provider, and we're going to use Derby for that. So when we started up this domain, Derby should have been running already. So go back to your terminal window. So in order to create the SQL authentication provider, we need to create a table structure within Derby to host our users and groups. And we're going to do that by connecting to the Derby database and issuing some SQL commands. So if you recall in one of the earlier labs, we used the Derby interactive shell to connect to a database. So go ahead and open up a new terminal window. And in order to launch the interactive Derby shell, we need to set Java home. Okay, so make sure that you've defined Java home. I have Java home defined as part of my shell. So make sure that you export Java home or set Java home depending on what environment that you're in first. So once you've done that, then you can start the Derby client, which is located under Oracle Home. WL server, common, Derby, bin, and inside bin is the IJ command. So go ahead and execute. Okay. Okay, so I didn't have executable permissions on the command, so I typed sh-ij to run it. In Windows, it looks like there's an available bat file that you can run. But in Linux or OS X, I typed sh, so shell ij, and you can see that I've got my prompt here, my IJ prompt. So now we want to connect to the database using a standard JDBC string. So the syntax is going to be connect. The syntax is in the lab guide. So I'm not going to verbalize it here, but go ahead and enter in the syntax. Now, the host name is the host name that you're running the admin server on. So I'm going to use localhost here since that's the host that I'm on. The port defaults to 1527, and the name of the database is examples. Now what we're going to do is specify the username and password to connect as. So that syntax is user examples and password examples. Okay, we're connected. So now what we're going to do is create a few tables. Now the tables that we're going to create have a standard DDL that WebLogic, that the default SQL Authenticator understands. You can define your own table structures if you'd like, and WebLogic allows you to define SQL statements for certain actions that it must perform. So you can define the interface that WebLogic uses to talk to your SQL database if you've got a custom table structure. So in the lab guide are the SQL commands that you need to execute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste from my lab guide into my window. And I'm going to do one set of create statements at a time. So here's one. So when you paste it in and hit enter, it will execute the create table DDL. This statement created a name, password, and description columns in the users table. Okay. So now repeat that for each of the SQL commands. Now you should be able to copy and paste all the commands at once. So I just pasted the remaining 4 commands, and that worked successfully. Actually, I missed a couple. So 2 more. Okay. So we've created 1, 2, 3 tables. Users, groups, and group members, which associates a group with a user. And so to verify that the tables were created, you can do a describe on, let's say, users. And we can see that it did in fact create a table with 3 columns. Fantastic. Okay. So go ahead and exit the Derby shell. Let's exit semicolon. Now switch back to the admin console. So let's go back to our browser. And we can now create the SQL Authenticator. So to do that, make sure that you're in the security realm under providers, under authentication, and click the new button. And give our SQL Authenticator a name. And so let's call it Derby SQL Authenticator. And the type. So when you click on type, you're going to see that there are a ton of identity and authentication providers here. I mean, out of the box, it supports Novell, OpenLDAP, OID, OVD, SQL. This is the one that we want. Windows Active Directory is supported, SAML. So go ahead and select the SQL Authenticator and click OK. And then now click on the provider that we just created. And under provider specific, this defines the details for the SQL Authenticator. So we have to tell the SQL Authenticator how to connect to the database. And we do that by specifying the name of a data source. And so if we go, I'm going to switch back and take a look at the data sources that are configured for this domain, and notice that there's an examples demo data source. And this examples demo data source, if I click on the connection pool tab, points to the Derby database instance, the examples database. So we can use this data source for our SQL Authenticator. So let's go back to the security realm. And then back to providers, back to our Derby SQL Authenticator, and under provider specific, go ahead and enter the name of the data source. Not sure why they don't provide a drop-down list here, but it's examples-demo. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can see some other parameters that you can configure for this SQL Authenticator, such as the hashing algorithm to store passwords. So we're using SHA-1 in this case. SHA-256 would be stronger for sure, and that's what most folks use in production environments. And then there's password styles, so you can store them in plain text, hashed, or salted and hashed. Salted and hashed is certainly more secure. Now, as I mentioned, if you had a custom schema, let's say the tables had different names or the columns had different names, you can define your own SQL statements to pull back the information. So you can see here, for instance, there's a SQL statement to get a user's password. Well, here it is. Select password from users, and then it's got a where clause. So if your columns were named differently, or the table were named differently, then you can update this SQL statement. And that goes for these other functions: set user password, check to see if a user exists, so on and so forth. So go ahead and click Save. Now notice at the top that we have that one item must be restarted for the changes to take effect. Now I know what item needs to be restarted. The only thing running is the admin server, and that's what needs to be restarted. But if you're working in a domain and you had multiple resources up and running and you don't know what to restart, go ahead and click on the View Changes and Restarts link in the Change Center and take a look at the Restart checklist. In the Restart checklist, it'll tell you what needs to be restarted. Now, we can't simply check the box here and click Restart. This only works if you have Node Manager configured. So go ahead and let's switch back to our terminal window and shut down the admin server. Now, I don't think I've mentioned this before, but you can kill the admin server if you've got a terminal window where the process is running and it's not in the background. Just go ahead and hit Control-C, and it's done. And start it back up. Okay, so the browser pops up again, so our admin server must be running. So let's switch back to the admin console. I'm going to close this window, refresh this page, and log back in as WebLogic. So we've created a SQL Authenticator, but it's not being used right now. So what we can do to test this SQL Authenticator is go ahead and we're going to create a new user and group. So to do that, we go to Security Realms. And on the Users and Groups tab, I can create users. So according to the lab, we need to create a user called SQL User. So click the New button. And the username is going to be SQL User. We'll leave description blank. But we have the option to associate this user with a particular authentication provider. So looking at the list here, I can choose either the default authenticator, which is the embedded LDAP store, or the Derby SQL database. Let's go ahead and pick the Derby SQL database, or Derby SQL Authenticator. And for password, we're going to use the default password that we've been using for all along, which is WebLogic123. And click OK. So notice the user created successfully message. WebLogic has now stored this SQL user in the Derby database. And to verify that, if you don't believe me, let's go ahead and open up that terminal window again and run the interactive Derby shell. We need to connect to the database. Can never remember the syntax. I gotta always look this up. So I'll connect to the examples database using the examples user. Okay, now do a select star from the users table. Oh, look at that lovely formatting. So we can see that the username is SQL user. Description is blank. Well, it's hard to tell by looking at this. And you can see that the password has been salted and hashed. So there it is. Okay, so let's switch back to the console again. And now we're going to create a group. So to do that, click on the Group subtab and click New. The process here is similar to the user. Let's create a group called App Admins and specify the Derby SQL Authenticator and click OK. And you should get a message that the group was created successfully. What we want to do now is we want to add the SQL user to the App Admins group. Before I do that though, take a look at this groups table in the last column here, and notice under provider it identifies the provider that's associated with that group. So when you connect WebLogic to an authentication provider, WebLogic will show you all the users or groups that are in that authentication provider. So if you had an LDAP store, an LDAP authentication provider, you would see those users here in this table. Okay, so back to assigning a user to a group. So to add a user to a group, go ahead and click on the Users subtab, and then click on the SQL user, and then you'll see there's subtabs up here. Click on the Groups subtab, and then add App Admins to the chosen list. So check the box, click the arrow, and make sure you hit Save. So this is great. So we've now created a user, a group, and assigned that user to the group. And we can verify this in the interactive Derby shell. So go back to your terminal window. And if you didn't disconnect already, do a select star from the other tables. So in groups, we have a single entry, which is App Admins. And then you can select star from group members. And you can see there's a row in here that associates the SQL user with the App Admins group.